Welcome back to Biographics. I'm your host, cosmic horror author Eric Malachite, and today's script was provided by James CJ. So if you have any questions or you're mad about something he wrote, drop them in the comments below. And be sure to deploy your likes, subscribe to the channel if you're not, and share this video with someone who loves learning about history and the people who made it happen. Let's get to it. America has always been this promised land of opportunity and freedom. As a result, it's become home to countless people who traveled thousands of miles from their home countries to get a taste of a better life. Often fleeing persecution, war, or a country in turmoil, they make the journey hoping for better days. One such refugee was Madeleine Albright. Madeleine Albright was the United States' first female Secretary of State. Before she died in 2022, Madeleine Albright lived a life breaking glass ceilings, promoting peace around the world and inspiring millions. Of course, a life in politics isn't without mistakes, and Albright made many. Whether or not those mistakes overshadow her accomplishments is a matter of personal opinion, but this is the story of Madeleine Albright, the refugee in the West Wing. On May 15, 1937, in Prague, Czechoslovakia, Mary Jean Madelinka Körbelova was born. Of course, we'd come to know her as Madeleine, a nickname given to her as a child. Her father, Josef Körbel, was the press attaché at the Czech embassy in Belgrade, so Madeleine's exposure to foreign affairs started from an early age. Madeleine's home country, Czechoslovakia, became a country in 1918 following the end of World War I and the collapse of the Austro-Hungary Empire. At the time of her birth in 1937, Czechoslovakia was under threat of invasion as Hitler sought to annex the Sudetenland. By March 1939, the Germans had fully invaded and began occupying Czechoslovakia. As a result of the occupation, the Körbels fled the country for England along with their 3 kids, including Madeleine, who wasn't even 2 yet. They fled for 2 reasons. 1, Josef Körbel was closely aligned with the Edvard Beneš government, and 2, the Körbels were Jewish. The family feared they'd meet a grim fate staying in a country that would not survive a German invasion. Albright learned later in life that she had 3 grandparents who died in concentration camps. As a result of their exile and fear of persecution for being Jewish, the 2 converted to Catholicism in 1941 and chose to keep their Jewish heritage a secret even from their children. Albright wasn't aware of her Jewish heritage until 1997. Before Europe showed signs of a new emerging war, Josef Körbel often described Czechoslovakia as a fortress of peace, democracy, and progress. He'd also point out that at the time, theirs was among the most stable of all European countries. In 1945, when the war subsided, Madeleine and her family returned home to Prague. It was almost like nothing had changed. Josef returned to his post as press attaché for Beneš's government, which had been operational in the UK throughout the war. Of course, everything had changed, and now the threat of communism in Europe was on the rise. Due to the heavy presence of communism in Yugoslavia at the time of their return to Belgrade, the family decided to send their children to a finishing school in Czechbra, which was located on Lake Geneva. This experience opened Marie to a world of knowledge. She learned to speak French and even changed her name from Marie Jana to the more French-sounding Madeleine. While Madeleine was far from the communist spread in Czechoslovakia, Josef and Anna were on the front lines, and eventually in 1948, the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia took over the government. Josef resigned from his position due to his opposition to communism, and he left for Kashmir with the United Nations, while his family went on to the United States. Of course, this wasn't the first time Albright was forced to leave Czechoslovakia. This, however, would be the one that stuck. On November 5th, 1948, the Körbel family departed from Southampton, London for Ellis Island. They arrived on November 11th seeking political asylum. Madeleine was 11. Thanks to a professor at Columbia, Josef was hired for the political science department in Colorado at the University of Denver. Madeleine Körbel went to Kent Denver School, where she graduated in 1955. Madeleine was always politically inclined, having learned from her father the ins and outs of the political machine. At her Denver high school, she founded an international relations club. After graduating high school, she got a full scholarship and headed to Massachusetts to study at Wellesley College, majoring in political science. In 1957, she'd return home and work for the Denver Post while on breaks from Wellesley. Here, she'd meet the man she'd fall in love with, Josef Albright. Madeleine Körbel and Joseph Albright wasted little time when it came to their relationship. Joseph was the son of painter Ivan Albright, and his family had extensive ties in journalism, having owned or started numerous publications. Within 6 weeks of knowing each other, they were engaged. The two were married in 1955, weeks after Madeleine graduated from Wellesley College. As a result of Joseph Albright's required military service, the two moved to Rolla, Missouri, while Madeleine worked at the Rolla Daily News. Following his service, the two moved to Chicago, Illinois in 1960. While Madeleine worked as a picture editor for Encyclopedia Britannica, Joseph worked for the Chicago Sun-Times. In 1961, they moved again to Garden City, Long Island, where Joseph began working at Newsday in New York. In 1961, Madeleine became a mother when she gave birth to twins Alice and Anne. Her daughters were born prematurely by 6 weeks, which required them to have an extended hospital stay. To keep her mind occupied while her daughter remained in the hospital, Madeleine began Russian language classes nearby, which she continued long after her daughters got better. Once the twins were given a bill of clean health, the Albrights moved to Georgetown near Washington, D.C. in 1962, where Albright began studying international relations and continued her Russian language lessons. When Joseph's aunt died in 1963, the family moved back to Long Island, anticipating that Joseph would have to take over the family business. In 1967, Albright gave birth to another daughter, Catherine, while she continued her studies, now at Columbia University's Department of Public Law and Government. She also earned herself a certificate in Russian from the Harriman Institute, then known as the Russian Institute. By 1968, Albright had already managed to achieve her master's and PhD. Following her academic success, she'd continue her interest in foreign affairs by taking a graduate course under her future boss, Zbigniew Brzezinski. As Albright entered her 30s with her academic qualifications in check, her professional career in international affairs was about to truly begin. By late 1968, Albright would return to Washington, D.C. While still studying further at Columbia, she played an active role in her children's education, often fundraising for her kids' school. Her involvement led to several education board positions, and she even ended up with an offer to fundraise for Maine Senator Ed Moskey's 1972 presidential campaign. While his presidential bid was unsuccessful, it had raised the awareness surrounding Albright. In 1976, President Jimmy Carter named Albright's former professor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, his national security advisor. Brzezinski hired Albright to work as a National Security Council congressional liaison in 1978. When Carter lost to Reagan in 1980, Albright was out of a job. Albright quickly moved on to work at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars at the Smithsonian. While there, she was granted money for research, choosing to focus on a dissident journalist who was involved in Poland's Solidarity movement. Madeleine traveled to Poland for 2 weeks as part of her research, interviewing dissidents in several areas of Poland. Several weeks after her return home, Joseph Albright delivered an unexpected blow. He was leaving her for another woman. By 1982, the divorce was finalized. Heartbroken yet undeterred, Albright kept going, gaining speed year by year. Albright spent the 1980s working closely with the Democratic Party as a foreign policy advisor. She worked closely with 1984 Vice President candidate Geraldine Ferraro with the Mondale campaign and 1988 presidential candidate Michael Dukakis. Unfortunately, both campaigns lost their bids for the White House. But it was in 1992 that decades of work in foreign affairs, policy, and relations would be utilized by then-incoming President Bill Clinton, whom she'd met in 1988 during the Dukakis campaign. Initially, Albright was designated to work with the transition team for the National Security Council in November 1992, preparing the department for the next president. When she completed her work there, Clinton nominated Albright to become the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. It wasn't the job she wanted, which was Deputy Secretary of State, but it would lead to something even better. Albright's tenure as U.S. ambassador to the United Nations was a mixed bag. One thing that remained obvious during her 4 years in the position was her relationship with then UN Secretary General Boutros Ghali, and that relationship was rocky at best. For starters, Madeleine took issue with the lack of action taken regarding the genocide in Rwanda in 1994. In her book, Madam Secretary, Albright states, "My deepest regret from my years in public service is the failure of the United States and the international community to act sooner to halt these crimes. The failure of the US to get involved in Rwanda faster and declare it a genocide largely has to do with the 1993 botched raid in Somalia. While Clinton supported peacekeeping and humanitarian efforts in Somalia in 1992, the 93 raid led to 18 American soldiers being killed by a Somali warlord, leading Clinton to retreat from what had become a dire situation, with American soldiers' bodies being paraded on television. The bulk of her criticism landed on Boutros-Ghali, whom she claimed was neglectful. The UN's involvement in Rwanda began in October 1993 with the United Nations Assistance Mission for Rwanda, or UNAMIR, overseeing the implementation of the Arusha Accords signed in August. Unfortunately, the Arusha Accords proved useless when the international community failed to act on several key factors of the agreement, including funding the program, which is kind of the bare minimum, never installing a transitional government, and failing to demobilize. As a result of inaction, Rwanda entered a civil war on April 7, 1994, lasting until July 19 that same year, with an estimated 500,000 to 800,000 deaths of the Tutsi ethnic group. While the death toll is still debated, with some arguments putting it at 2 million, calling it a genocide became more fact than opinion. Several years later, in 1996, Albright entered a deal with several other US officials in the State Department to get rid of Boutros-Ghali. They believed it wouldn't be challenging thanks to failures on his part surrounding Rwanda and the 1993 botched raid in Somalia. While they hoped other countries might join their objections, they remained the only veto. This went on for 4 separate meetings where the US remained firm with its veto, and Boutros-Ghali dropped out of the race. On December 17, 1996, Kofi Annan was announced as the next Secretary General. Albright's efforts to get rid of Boutros-Ghali didn't go unnoticed by anyone in the Clinton administration, and it certainly helped her on her pathway to becoming something much bigger than ambassador to the UN. With Clinton securing a second term in 1996, there were some shakeups in the White House when it came to the president's cabinet. One major gap in leadership would be at the Senate Department, where Secretary of State Warren Christopher intended to retire. Albright quickly became a possible contender for the position after her strong performance as U.S. ambassador to the UN. Getting the position of Secretary of State was by no means easy, though. Albright might have been a contender in Clinton's eyes, but many on his team seemed vehemently opposed to her nomination. Several camps in the White House gave their candidate choices, and the first string all proved incapable of garnering enough votes in the Republican-controlled Senate to take on the job. But with each round of suggestions, Albright's name was absent. This led to Madeleine embarking on a campaign to win the nomination by any means necessary. This meant garnering the support of numerous members of Congress, the vice president, and other members of the Democratic Party who still had some clout even though they weren't front and center anymore. In the end, Madeleine prevailed, and on December 5, 1996, was announced as the nominee to the coveted Secretary of State position, having beaten out numerous men for the title. On January 22, 1997, the Senate confirmed her nomination, and Madeleine Albright became the first female Secretary of State in the United States' history. For the next 4 years, Albright was about to leave a lasting legacy on U.S. foreign policy filled with highs and lows. The biggest aspect of Madeleine Albright's time as Secretary of State can be attributed to the Balkans, of which she was heavily involved. Her involvement started years before her time as Secretary of State, with it being a focus of her UN ambassadorship too. In 1992, when Yugoslavia was being separated, she championed this move. In 1998, when conflict broke out in Kosovo between ethnic Albanians and ethnic Serbians, Madeleine's support showed up in several ways, and unfortunately showed up more for one side than the other. She supported the NATO 78-day bombardment of Serb-led Yugoslavia and advocated for bringing charges of war crimes against all those committed against the Balkans, including from former Serbian President Slobodan Milosevic and the Bosnian Serb leader Radovan Karadzic. These actions resulted in her critics deeming the war Madeleine's war, while also painting her as a Serb hater. In Kosovo, Albright is celebrated, but in Serbia, she is derided for her time as Secretary of State. In October 2012, while at a book signing, Albright was confronted by Serbian protesters, and she was filmed stating, "Disgusting Serbs, get out," which has by no means helped to prove that she's not a Serb hater. The extent of Albright's involvement in Kosovo, even beyond her time in government, is something still not entirely understood. In 2012, when the protesters confronted Albright, her investment group was seeking to bid on the proposed privatization of Kosovo's state-owned post and telecom companies. This deal was eventually withdrawn due to Serbian backlash. In 2000, the final year of the Clinton administration, Albright found herself to be yet another first. She became the highest-ranking Western official to visit North Korea and meet with then-leader Kim Jong-il. It was among her final acts in office, but was one of the most impressive considering North Korea's stance on isolationism, which only grew in the 2000s. At the time, it was clear North Korea wanted to engage with the West, but that time has long since passed. Some foreign policy positions naturally translate from one administration to the next. For the Clinton to Bush administrations, the policy of Iraq's sanctions and their supposed weapons of mass destruction were crossover issues. A little over a week away from the Bush administration taking over, Albright consulted with Kofi Annan surrounding sanctions in Iraq and how they'd only be lifted should weapons of mass destruction be destroyed. Of course, this would become a far bigger issue in the coming years under the Bush administration. January 20th, 2001 marked the end of Albright's time as Secretary of State as Bill Clinton's presidency ended. Her time in the State Department gave her an acute understanding of international affairs, a level of education that only a job of such international demand could produce. How she'd apply that to her life beyond the State Department wasn't clear to her just yet. Albright pondered her next move following the transition between the Clinton and Bush administrations. In August 2001, Albright founded the Albright Group, later the Albright-Stonebridge Group, a business strategy firm with the goal of helping socially responsible companies prosper by advising clients on international policy and global markets. Albright's work with the Albright Group saw her communicating with governments worldwide again, working with her team to turn significant problems into easier-to-manage issues. For example, she helped lead an effort to broker deals and guide the process of providing HIV/AIDS antiretroviral treatments to the people in Botswana and Romania with Merck Pharmaceuticals. She also was a part of an educational campaign in Poland that stressed women's health, which at the time was an issue, especially with older women. Between 2001 and 2003, Albright began writing her memoir, Madam Secretary, which would obviously cover her life. She began consulting with former aides on her time in office and official files to achieve a timeline to accurately depict her life and career. Released in 2003, Madam Secretary was her first published work, but over the next nearly 2 decades, she'd have 6 more books published. In early 2003, Albright took a position on the New York Stock Exchange, or NYSE, board of directors. She chose to serve only one 2-year term, leaving in 2005. During her time at the NYSE, she saw as the public began turning on Wall Street and the revelation of Chairman Richard Grosso's ridiculous compensation, made up of a $1.4 million base pay, $1 million bonus, and incentives that resulted in a total compensation of $130.5 million. This wasn't her reasoning for leaving her post in 2005, but it likely contributed to her decision. Of course, she did state she'd only ever intended to serve one term. For the most part, the next few years would see Madeleine continuing her work in international affairs, working on several boards of directors representing her firm, Albright-Stonebridge. She also participated in guest spots on television shows such as Gilmore Girls and my favorite, Parks and Rec, portraying herself. Albright was keeping busy, and she was about to find herself getting behind another Clinton running for the highest office in the land. While Madeleine was no longer in the West Wing, Washington's politics never strayed too far. Her involvement in politics for a long time was more about providing an opinion on then-current issues like the Iraq War and the War on Terror. In 2008, she endorsed Hillary Clinton in her unsuccessful primary to become the Democratic presidential candidate. Then in 2012, she campaigned for Obama, becoming a powerful surrogate for his re-election. She again supported Clinton in her 2016 bid for the White House, making her opinions on then-candidate Trump known. Albright believed he was a danger to democracy. When she released her book Fascism, A Warning in 2018, she critiqued then-President Trump, stating, "Trump is the most anti-democratic leader that I have studied in American history." Outside of her various remarks about Clinton's rival, Albright found herself in hot water during the 2016 Democratic primary campaign for Hillary when she said, "There's a special place in hell for women who don't help each other," when introducing Clinton in a New Hampshire campaign event. While this was a phrase Albright had used numerous times before, it was seen as an attack on young women and made it seem like Clinton should be supported by women purely because she was a woman, given the setting. Albright addressed these comments, stating, "I absolutely believe what I said, that women should help one another, but this was the wrong context and the wrong time to use that line." Controversies aside, the decades following her stint as Secretary of State were about as calm as her time in office. Albright spent years working with various think tanks, institutions, and companies in numerous different roles as an advisor, chairwoman, founder, and more. She garnered over 11 honorary degrees from various colleges, received numerous awards, and graced the Time magazine 100 Most Powerful Women Who Defined the Last Century list in 2020 and Forbes' 50 over 50 list in 2021. One might have expected the extent of Madeleine Albright's achievements to have been pre-2000, when she held high-ranking positions in government, but the following decades proved otherwise. Writing 6 books, consulting, brokering deals between countries and companies, chairing numerous boards, remaining a powerful voice in the political world, and more are all equally a part of Albright's legacy. On March 23, 2022, Madeleine Albright died at the age of 84 of cancer. Until the end, Albright never allowed herself to become out of touch with international affairs, which had defined her life. Albright was more than just a trailblazer. She advocated for peace, diplomacy, women, children, and more. Her record is far from clean, with many aspects of her long career, particularly her time in government, open to scrutiny and debate. Unfortunately, there will always be conflicting versions of Madeleine Albright, ultimately boiling down to personal opinion. But like politics and global affairs, it's complicated. I hope you learned something today, and if you dug today's video, be sure to like the video, comment down below, subscribe to the channel if you're not, and share this video with someone who loves learning about history. I'm Eric Malachite, and I'll see you next time, Space Cowboy.